It is the early hours of September 19th, 1944. The air over the Scheldt Estuary hangs thick and salt damp, the kind of cold that settles in the bones before a man even knows he is shivering. Along the mudflats and poldered fields of the Dutch and Belgian coastline, German forces have held the estuary with a grip that has strangled Allied supply lines for weeks. The port of Antwerp, captured largely intact just a fortnight before, sits tantalizingly useless behind a 50-kilometre corridor of occupied waterway. Without the Scheldt, there is no Antwerp. Without Antwerp, there is no winter offensive. Without a winter offensive, the war grinds on into another year, perhaps two. In the darkness, the men of the Royal Marines Armored Support Group make their final preparations. The landing craft are loaded. The briefings have been given and given again. What these men are about to carry on to the beaches of Walcheren Island, a heavily fortified, deliberately flooded piece of the Netherlands that should, by every calculation, be nearly impossible to assault from the water, is not a standard weapon of war. It is something quieter than that, something that, within weeks of this very morning, will be locked away in files marked for limited circulation, its precise specifications buried, its very existence discouraged from polite discussion. Its name is the Centaur Close Support Tank, mounted on landing craft, and what it is about to do will reshape the outcome of the Scheldt campaign in ways that even the men firing it will not fully understand until years later. This is the story of a weapon that won a battle at a moment when a battle desperately needed to be won, and then, quietly and with considerable British efficiency, was almost entirely forgotten. To understand why this weapon existed at all, you have to go back to a problem that had haunted Allied planners since the earliest days of the war. Amphibious assault is, as one Royal Navy officer put it with characteristic understatement, a profoundly unpleasant business. The fundamental difficulty is not the crossing of water. It is the moment when landing craft touch sand and the ramps come down. In those seconds, infantry are at their most exposed, stationary, bunched together, moving forward into positions that defenders have had days or weeks to prepare. Artillery support, the traditional solution, faces an almost impossible geometry. Naval guns firing from ships offshore must lift their fire before troops reach the beach, creating a gap of silence precisely when suppression is most needed. The men who ran the beaches at Dieppe in August 1942 paid for that gap with roughly 900 dead and nearly 2,000 taken prisoner in a raid that lasted less than 10 hours. The lessons of Dieppe were absorbed with the kind of grim thoroughness that comes from catastrophe. What emerged after months of analysis was a deceptively simple requirement, something that could fire directly onto beach defenses at close range, from a moving platform, until the very moment infantry went ashore. It needed to be armored enough to absorb small arms fire and survive the chaos of the surf. It needed enough firepower to suppress concrete emplacements, bunkers, and gun positions that conventional naval fire might miss or skip over. And it needed to be mounted on something that could survive the open sea. The answer the British arrived at was, on its surface, elegantly straightforward, though its execution required solving problems that had no obvious precedent. The key was the Centaur tank. The Centaur, produced from 1942 onwards at factories in Birmingham and the English Midlands, was a cruiser tank roughly equivalent in size to a large motor lorry, about 6 meters long, weighing approximately 28 tons. Its armor was not exceptional by the standards of 1944, running to about 76 millimeters at the turret front, but it was not intended to fight other tanks. What mattered was the gun. The close support variant of the Centaur was fitted with a 95 millimeter howitzer, a weapon primarily designed to fire high explosive rounds at relatively short range with a significant degree of destruction. Picture the report of that weapon. Not the crack of a high-velocity anti-tank gun, which is a sharp, almost surgical sound, but something deeper and more physical, closer to the noise made by a very large door slamming shut in an enclosed space, felt as much as heard at any distance under half a kilometre. The shell it fired weighed roughly 11 kilograms. Its effect on an unprotected position was, according to contemporary accounts, extremely discouraging. The engineering challenge was not the gun, it was the sea. A centaur on dry land is one proposition. A centaur on a landing craft, tank, an LCT, crossing open water in October weather is quite another. The modifications required were extensive and largely improvised, developed by the Royal Armoured Corps in collaboration with the Royal Marines and a number of engineering workshops whose names do not appear prominently in standard histories. Waterproofing was addressed at the hull and engine compartment. Mountings were reinforced to account for the role and pitch of the LCT in coastal waters. Ammunition stowage was rethought to prevent the shock of wave action from causing unintended movement. The tanks were, in the parlance of the engineers involved, tropicalized and marinized, which is a technical way of saying they were made to do something they were never originally designed to do. The Royal Marines Armored Support Group, formed in late 1943 and trained extensively through the first half of 1944, operated 80 of these vehicles, though that figure comes with the caveat that precise production and deployment records remain partially classified or simply incomplete. The crews were trained not as conventional tankmen, but as a fire support element, their job being to remain on their landing craft, engines running, guns firing, for as long as the assault required, then, if conditions permitted, to come ashore as a mobile reserve. It was a role without a precise historical precedent. The training for it had to be largely invented. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The battle for Walcheren Island, fought between 1 and 8 November 1944, provides the clearest operational record of what these weapons could do under the worst possible circumstances. Walcheren is a roughly circular island, or it was before RAF Bomber Command breached the sea dikes in October, deliberately flooding its interior to deny the Germans firm ground. What remained accessible was a narrow rim of elevated land, principally the town of Flushing to the south, the village of Westkapelle on the western coast, and the causeway approaches further east. German defenses were substantial. Coastal battery positions, concrete gun emplacements, and field fortifications that had been constructed and improved over 4 years of occupation. The assault at Westkapelle on November 1st went in under conditions that contemporaries described as difficult, and that photographs suggest were genuinely appalling. Heavy surf, smoke from burning craft obscuring fields of fire, German guns returning fire on the approach. The LCTs carrying the Centaur troops came in close, firing as they approached, and kept firing after the infantry had gone ashore. Eyewitness accounts from Marine gunners describe the rhythm of it, the loading, the moment of firing, the physical jolt through the deck, the brief observation of where the round had struck, the correction, the reload. One sergeant recorded in his diary, a document not formally declassified until the 1970s, that the crew fired over 120 rounds in the course of the morning. The barrel, he noted, was warm enough to cook on by midday. The effect on German defensive positions was documented with some care for precision in post-battle assessments. At least 4 gun emplacements were destroyed or put out of action by Centaur fire before infantry reached them. Resistance at several beach exits that had been expected to be heavily contested was found, on the day, to be lighter than anticipated. Whether this was directly attributable to the Centaur fire or to some combination of factors, naval bombardment, air support, the general disruption of the German defense, is a question the historical record cannot answer cleanly. What is documented is that the assault succeeded. The island fell within a week, and the Scheldt Estuary was open to Allied shipping by November 28, 1944. The Germans had nothing precisely equivalent to the Centaur close support configuration at this point in the war. Their own armored forces were by 1944 primarily oriented toward counterattack and anti-armor roles, and the concept of a purpose-modified tank deployed from landing craft as a direct fire support element had not been developed in the same systematic way. The Americans, who conducted their own large-scale amphibious operations across both theaters, had experimented with self-propelled artillery on landing craft, but their solutions, including various configurations of the Sherman tank and the 105mm howitzer motor carriage, were generally larger, heavier, and less precisely adapted to the close support role as the British understood it. The Centaur's 95mm howitzer, firing from a platform that could operate in relatively shallow coastal water, occupied a tactical niche that neither American nor German engineers had quite defined in the same terms. The broader Allied amphibious program by 1944 had produced a remarkable variety of improvised solutions. Swimming tanks, rocket-firing craft, engineer vehicles designed to clear beach obstacles, but the Centaur close-support variant was unusual in that it was neither a conversion of existing equipment nor a wholly new design, but something in between, a standard tank chassis, fitted with a specialist weapon operated by a specialist unit, in a role that had been specifically created because a gap in capability had been identified and methodically filled. That methodical quality is, in retrospect, one of the more interesting aspects of the story. The immediate post-war legacy of the Centaur Close Support Program is one of those historical ironies that rewards close attention. The weapon worked. The operation it supported succeeded. The Scheldt campaign, taken as a whole, is regarded by military historians as one of the more effective Allied operations of the Northwest Europe campaign, notable for achieving its objective, the opening of Antwerp, in a time frame and at a cost that, while not trivial, was considerably less than some pre-operational estimates had suggested. The Centaur contribution to that outcome is referenced in a handful of after-action reports, acknowledged in one or two official histories in language that is notably circumspect, and then largely absent from the popular record. Part of the explanation for this is structural. The Royal Marines Armored Support Group was disbanded in 1945, its vehicles and records dispersed. The Centaur tank in general was replaced by the Cromwell and later the Comet, and the close support variant did not outlast the operational circumstances that had created it. The Cold War brought different priorities. The particular configuration of skills, equipment, and doctrine that had been assembled for the Scheldt was not preserved as a going concern. Institutional memory, in armies as in corporations, tends to be shorter than we imagine. There's also something in the nature of the weapon itself that made it resistant to celebration. It was not a decisive weapon in the way that, say, the Sherman Firefly, with its ability to kill a Tiger tank at range, could be called decisive. It was a supporting weapon, whose contribution was to make other things possible. The infantry to land, the infantry to advance, the defenses to crack at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Supporting weapons are, by definition, harder to write about than weapons that deliver the killing blow. A handful of surviving Centaur tanks exist in museum collections across the United Kingdom. The Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset holds examples of the type, and serious researchers with the appropriate access have been able to consult records held there and at the National Archives in Kew. The close support variant, modified for amphibious operations, is less well represented in the physical record. The modifications were in most cases undone after the war, and the tanks either scrapped or returned to something closer to standard configuration before disposal. Return, then, to that morning on the Scheldt. The light is coming up over the poldered fields and the flooded land. The craft are moving. The guns are firing. In the turret of one of the LCT-mounted Centaurs, a Marine sergeant is watching the beach through his optics, calling corrections, and his crew is reloading, round after round, in the methodical rhythm that training produces when training has been done well. He does not know that in 3 years he will be a civilian. He does not know that in 5 years the unit he belongs to will have ceased to exist. He does not know that the weapon under his hands will, in time, become a footnote rather than a chapter, or perhaps less than a footnote. What he knows is the task in front of him, the next emplacement, the next correction, the next round. The beach below is clearing. The infantry are moving. That is what these weapons did. They did it at the moment it needed to be done in weather that should have made it impossible, against defenses that should have held. They opened the Scheldt, which opened Antwerp, which fed the Allied advance through the winter and into the spring of 1945. The men who operated them received no separate campaign medal, no distinct commemoration, no naming in the dispatches of the famous. The files were closed. The tanks were dispersed. But on the morning of November 1st, 1944, on a flooded Dutch island that most people today could not place on a map, a weapon that should not quite have existed did something that needed to be done. That is a narrower kind of glory than history usually celebrates. It is also, in its quiet way, the most British kind there is.